Thank you everybody for joining us today for our latest PAVE weekly virtual panel, AVs on Rural Roadways. You can find the full recording of this panel and all our others on our website at www.pavecampaign.org or follow us on social media at PAVE Campaign to keep up with all the things that we're doing. My name is Tabitha Coulter and I'm PAVE's Director of Operations and the moderator for today's panel. Today is the second panel in our February series where we're focusing on equity in AVs. Driving automation touches on many different equity topics, and we're excited to address the second one this month with rural access. So our first panelist I'd like to introduce for today is Alex Lybarger, Assistant Director of Advanced Mobility at Transportation Research Center, TRC. Alex, great to have you here today.
Yeah, fantastic to be here again, Tabitha. Thank you. Looking forward to it today.
And our second panelist is a member of our PAVE Public Sector Advisory Council, Rich Granger. Rich is the Managing Director of Workforce and Economic Development at DriveOhio. Rich, great to have you.
Nice to be here. Thanks.
And last but not least, our third panelist is one of our PAVE Academic Advisory Council members, Dr. Jiaqi Ma, Associate Professor of Civil and Engineering and Environmental Engineering at UCLA. Jiaqi, wonderful to have you here.
Thank you. Great to be here.
So with those introductions done, we want to dive right into the conversation today. It's a fascinating one, and we got a ton of audience questions that I'm going to try to cover as many as we can. So at the risk of starting too broad, I want to start by laying some context. Alex, I was hoping you could start us off and sort of address the question of what sort of active work today is going on with rural applications for AVs, either in research, public sector deployments, pilots, anything there you could add.
Yeah, I can definitely start the conversation and pass along to the other two on the call. There's definitely a lot of things happening. Most you don't hear about because they're happening behind closed doors and in industry. And so a lot of it's focused around the challenges that come with operating in these types of environments. How do these technologies work? And I know that's a question we're going to get to in a little bit, so I'm not going to go down that rabbit hole. But some of the things that we can talk about are Ohio has won an ADS demonstration grant, and we're going to talk about that a couple more times on this call, which focuses on gathering data for deployments in rural Ohio or in rural counties. And there's another project we have working right now, and we're not just focusing on the high level automation. This is a problem all the way down to your level 1, level 2 driver assistance systems. So we're working on a project right now in Athens County of Ohio that focuses on those systems as well, gathering data, showing where these systems work and don't work. I know there's a couple other grant winners out there like Iowa won as well. And yeah, as far as what I can talk about and from what we've been working on with our clients, people are interested in this area, but it hasn't got as much of the attention as the urban areas have.
Yeah. And Jiaqi, as our kind of academic on the panel, I was wondering if you could talk about some of the work being done from an academic research standpoint on rural applications.
Sure. The rural AV applications indeed has not attracted as much attention as the urban applications, but you have seen that more and more research teams across the country, across the world, been looking at different aspects of the rural AV applications. Now, the one aspect is the technology itself, automated driving technology itself. For example, one of the biggest problems people have been worrying about rural AV is the HD maps that urban driving usually, complex urban driving usually require. And it's a luxury to have HD maps for all the rural roads in this country. So many research teams have started developing, they call mapless driving, or as some similar form. Basically, the idea is that they can use their existing sensors, right? The GPS for sure, but also some of the LiDAR and radar sensor, onboard sensors to do that real-time mapping to enable your driving on the places where there are no HD maps. So this is from a technology itself, but also from a transportation systems perspective, how to provide the mobility services in rural areas, as we know that mobility service in rural areas has been traditionally underserved. Those people, if they don't have good transportation options, mode choices in rural areas. So people have been designing, thinking about AV as an option to connecting you know, the people's homes in rural areas, which is really sparsely dispersed in the rural areas, and two, some of the backbone transportation networks like the public transit networks. You know, people in the network design community has been looking at that problem for the past couple of years.
Yeah, absolutely. And you touched on some of this, but Rich, I was hoping you could kind of explain what are some of those main mobility related challenges that rural populations do face in the US?
Absolutely. Yeah, as you said, Josh, you touched on some of that. And when we looked at this important question as we were considering our application for the U.S. Department of Transportation Automated Driving Systems grant that Alex referred to, and we were very fortunate to be selected there. You know, we were asking that question of what about rural communities? What is it about transportation in rural communities? And when we talk to our partners down in Southeast Ohio and in other rural parts of the state, the answer is it kind of touches everything. I mean, transportation and mobility are just so central to how people get access to jobs, access to healthcare, access to education. So and then you look at the conditions in a rural setting that include longer travel distances, a relative lack of transit, and transit looks different in those rural settings. So you don't maybe have as many fixed routes. It's a little more on demand. The funding models may be a little bit different. And then add in, you know, in Southeast Ohio is part of the Appalachian region. You've got both economic challenges, but also just the terrain itself. I think Josh, you touched on that a little bit, but you've got very rugged hills, you've got gravel roads, you've got sometimes a lack of connectivity and bandwidth. And please don't take any of these as criticisms of rural settings. It's just the conditions that we see right now. And so, you know, how do you chip away at that and make sure that transportation is not a barrier to all those things that people need to access? Those are a lot of the fundamental challenges that we're looking at from both a societal perspective, but then also, I'm sure we'll get into the technology challenges that those environments also present.
Yeah, absolutely. Alex, could you talk about how AVs might address some of those challenges that Rich was just discussing?
Yeah, exactly as Rich was saying, there's a lot of challenges that are different within, I guess, the state of Ohio and what you see in throughout the country and where a lot of the deployments and vehicles are on the road today, but also specifically in the rural setting. So weather's a big one. Weather just comes with being in the Midwest, coming in the North, but also different pavement markings, pavement conditions. Some of these rural roadways don't even have lane markings to denote the edge of the roadway. So it just goes straight from asphalt to grass or asphalt to gravel. Then you have different, as Josh and Rich said, terrain, so hills, which prevents the sensors on the vehicles. It's called line of sight, and if they can't see where they're going, and if they don't have the HD maps, as Josh was talking about, that presents another problem. Additionally, we have a lot of deployments happening now in urban environments, which for most part are either highway or low-speed shuttles. For the applications Rich was talking about, this is transporting people on these county roads where 45, 55 miles per hour, where it's just a 2-lane bi-directional road and very, very high speeds in very close proximity going opposite directions. And these are just minor differences to an urban environment, but it's very important to make sure that we're safe in that type of an environment. And so what we can do is collect data. We can go out there and drive, and what kind of our project is about is to collect data for developers and also for infrastructure owners. So it's not it's not just put on the people developing the vehicles, but also there's some areas where the people that own the infrastructure, that put down the lane markings, to understand what the technology can do. That's even more important to make the roadways safer and better for these vehicles to operate in.
Yeah, and I do want to get into some of those details of some of the infrastructure operating domain, but kind of before we do that, Jiaqi, is there anything else you want to add on some of those broad benefits that rural areas might see from AV technologies and testing?
I think, first of all, I think rural areas, because it's a relatively simpler driving environment, it's unlike the urban environment. You know, you have to make your technology very correct to be able to test there because there's so many interactions. But naturally, rural environment, because there are not much vehicles on there, the road is relatively empty, particularly in the very remote areas. It kind of provide a good opportunity for, I think, some companies to test their technologies. For example, they can provide a AV pickup and delivery services or shuttle services on those environments without need to worrying about a lot of problems in the urban areas. I think that can give some benefits there. But eventually, the AV, Alex mentioned of the from technology perspective, the challenges, how we address them. But then, from a transportation system perspective, right? It probably, as I said, AVs can serve as first mile, last mile solutions. Maybe in the rural, not just first mile, last mile, a couple of miles solutions to connecting to the transportation, public transit or other modes of transportation system that's already serving the urban and suburban areas. And as we know that we hopefully that we have a level 5 fully autonomous vehicles that can really pick up and deliver, these areas. We can have even reservation systems, because it doesn't make sense for vehicles to just like urban area to just keep on finding the next customer. But if we can have a reservation systems that, okay, this AV will know that by this time I need to pick up this passenger and deliver that passenger, then we can do a system optimization to really develop the most cost-effective solutions to really feed to connecting that rural parts to the existing transportation systems. I think there's a lot of work that we can be done for the rural components.
Yeah, absolutely. And Rich, as we kind of think about that from your more public sector perspective, as you think about the future of autonomous vehicles with rural roadways and communities, do you see it more as an extension of urban transit systems that are then connecting to rural communities, or something kind of completely different?
So with DriveOhio being an initiative of the Ohio Department of Transportation, and with our team focused on smart mobility, and with ODOT's mission being the safe and effective movement of people and goods in all settings, this is right in our wheelhouse in terms of what we talk about every day. So when you talk about the movement of goods and the movement of people in these rural settings, those are the use cases that we're looking at. To your question about linking to urban centers, that's always a possible scenario. A lot of times we just want to meet the infrastructure, meet the communities where they're at today. That's what our ADS grant in Ohio is all about, is just saying, with the state of the technology as it currently exists, with the state of the infrastructure as it currently exists, let's just put them together, get out on the roads and find out where the gaps are to understand, if there are certain, if the technology development is trending a certain way because it's maybe been oversteered towards urban settings, let's see if we need to do some course corrections and look at, both the technical case, the use case, and we'll talk, I'm sure, later about the business case for all of this. And so the scenarios we baked into this project to help make some progress on that, we will be, equipping some Ford Transit style vans with level 3 automation. You can imagine those carrying goods or people. I mean, if I had my window open, you'd probably see another Amazon truck right behind me zooming down the street like that. But also for, I think we'll probably touch on paratransit as well, and other movement of people and important services like that. And then we'll also have some trucking involved in this project as well. So some level 2 automation on trucking over longer haul routes. To look at how it affects that piece of the puzzle as well. And we know there's work happening in the Southwest US already and in other parts of the country, but when you add that good old fashioned Midwest snow, which you might also see out my window there, that's another variable that we have to consider in all of this.
Yeah, and so as we kind of think through those different applications of AV technology that you're talking about in rural settings, I think a whole range of questions arise on how rural roads compare to urban roads. We got a lot of questions on, so I think it is a popular topic. So Jiaqi, I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about how rural roadways compare as an operating domain for an AV to their suburban or their urban counterparts.
Sure. So I think for the urban and the suburban scenarios, there's a lot of studies that have been understanding, how automated vehicles can drive on those roads, and infrastructure has been maintained very well. They have very clear pavement markings. You have very nicely maintained signs, and so on, right? And then you even have a very good infrastructure at key locations. For example, those smart detectors at signalized intersections will be able to provide you additional data. And we have been talking about connected vehicles, and this is actually another layer talking about connected and automated vehicles, feeding these automated vehicles, provide them enough data. However, in rural areas, we don't have that luxury, right? The pavement markings become a little bit problem, and the signs are usually not maintained as well as in the urban areas. I'm not blaming anybody, but this is what I personally have seen. So I think, and then it raises a lot of problems for AVs using their computer vision, right? To see those signs. And the rural areas, sometimes, mostly, a lot of cases they're in like mountainous areas. They will suffer adverse weather conditions like foggy conditions. And they have a lot of big curvatures on the roadway, like the geometric conditions are much more challenging. And this gives the regular urban AVs some difficulties to be able to operate on those environments. So I think, but a good side is that rural operating environment is usually simpler, right? So that's why you see that a lot of the particular long haul trucking industry, they have been doing application like exit to exit, long distance truck automation. It's just partially because the driving environment is relatively simpler, and they will be able to manage that without worrying about the complexity in the urban driving environments. So I think there's the pros and cons of rural environments, but absolutely, there's a lot of challenges remain to be solved in the rural environments to enable AV to drive.
Yeah, and Alex, as we're thinking about some of those technical challenges that a rural AV might face, I was hoping you could answer an audience question we got from a member at ADAC Automotive who asked, do you envision that you could tell a rural AV to drive off the road, go down something like a Forest Service road and set up a campsite, or do you think it'll be more likely to be restricted to designated locations for driving and parking?
So the easy answer is, of course, we'd love it to do that. We'd love to tell the vehicle to do that. But as you look at where the applications stand right now, it's mostly around a level 4 system, which is geofenced and has a very defined ODD, an operational design domain. And the vehicle goes from, whether it be picking up a person or goods and delivering those, being that first mile, last mile solution. A lot of these will rely heavily on having a mapped environment. But as Jiaqi was saying, there's newer technology out there that allows vehicles to either map on the fly or operate without a map. And this helps us get to that level 5, where you can tell your vehicle to go anywhere a human can go. And so that's the end goal. Everybody says level 5's way off into the distance, but it starts by collecting data. If we identify use cases for these systems, it might be simpler to add something like going on a gravel road, going from campsite to campsite, and it doesn't have to be paved or striped or anything. If we identify this and identify that as an operational design domain, then you confine it to that and make your vehicle operate in that restricted area. That's a level 4 system. It's going to take some time and some effort, and all of us on the call know how much time and effort that'll take, but it's that step that needs to happen. I think identifying the use cases is very important. And this is a very unique case, and it's something that I don't see a reason why it can't be done. Operating on different types of terrain, we've already seen, whether it be agricultural units, ATVs, there's unmanned vehicles operating in every type of terrain right now. They just might be carrying less people, or they might be carrying goods, or they might be used for a different application. But bringing that to the vehicle side, I don't see why that's that far off.
Yeah, absolutely. And kind of as we're thinking through some of those infrastructure questions, it's something we hear a lot from our public sector partners that they're always wondering about the infrastructure needs of roadways. So as we think about that for rural roads, Jiaqi, could you talk about are there some unique infrastructure investments that are needed to either enable or accelerate rural deployments, anything like roads, signage, connectivity, maps?
Yeah. I think there are two types of infrastructure, at least personally, I've been thinking about. One is the more advanced, sensing and communication infrastructure. However, as I mentioned, in urban areas at key bottleneck location like freeway merge points or signalized intersections, it is always possible to deploy those. You have enough justification in safety and so on. However, in rural areas, because of less congestion, now safety is always a concern, but because the vast stretch of the rural roads, it's very hard to know, where you want to deploy those sensors or communication devices along those ways. From my perspective, unless we find a very economical way to do that, it's hard to develop those advanced infrastructure. Then we come to some basic infrastructure that DOTs agencies use to maintain, for example, the signs and the pavement markings. And frankly, for incorporating these AVs into the national highway systems in early stages, we really have to consider, right, the benefit cost of deploying or maintaining, enhancing this infrastructure. I've read about and talked to some of the friends in this sort of early days AV infrastructure world. Some of them talking about special pavement markings that are more retroreflective, and even during weather conditions, the AVs can still see that. And some of the traffic signs that, for example, stop signs or curve signs, will encode some of the, something like the 2D code that can only be seen by AVs, but not seen by human eyes, right? Those codes can provide AVs some additional information. These kind of very incremental infrastructure enhancement has been discussed by different private and public sectors, but I see that's more feasible solution, at least in the short run, to improve the infrastructure.
Yeah, that's super useful. And Rich, I wanted to kind of come back to you now and talk about when we think about opportunities for rural applications of AVs, one question that comes up a lot is economic viability. So could you talk a little bit, are there sufficient economic opportunities for AVs in rural areas that you expect to be pursued organically by companies, or is that something more that public transit agencies are needing to take the lead on to make them happen?
It's an incredibly important question, because just because you can solve something technically doesn't mean the business model is ready to catch that technology and then scale it up. What we're doing as an example is using this ADS. We view this ADS grant in several ways. It has several potential benefits for both the national and international audience that will consume the data that comes out of the project. We've actually called our project Deploying Automated Technology Anywhere, spells out data. Because the whole point of that ADS program is to collect data and share it up. So a part of that is to get that information out there. We also look at this grant as in some ways almost like seed money for developing this ecosystem. While we're testing out the technology, we're not going to be offering a turnkey ride-hail service in a rural setting during this program. What we are going to be doing is deploying level 3 transit vans to test out routes that are informed by community feedback that could then lead to those business models. Ideally, we are adding in some, Ohio University is a key partner on this in Athens. And so, can we bring in faculty and students to help innovate around business models, not just the technology of this, and bring in other community members like the Buckeye Hills Regional Council down there and other great partners to explore that. Does public transit have a role? Absolutely. Figuring out how that works is part of the community engagement on this program. And on the trucking side, we have every intention of enlisting one or maybe more fleet partners on this to integrate the level 2 technology into live deliveries in the region. Again, with the hope that this starts to stick and becomes adopted. And I would say the most audacious goal we have for this initiative is to make the Appalachian region a national test bed for rural deployments of automated vehicles, both from a technology standpoint and a business case. I mean, we're investing in the region with the Broadband Ohio initiative, the Build Out Broadband, the state budget that was just announced recently and is under discussion, has significant funding around broadband that starts to chip away at some of that infrastructure we talked about. And we're having a holistic discussion around the state about electrification. We put out an electric vehicle charging study last year, and so many of these automated vehicles are also likely to be electric that we need to build out some of that infrastructure too. So if we have all the pieces starting to come together, we cannot ignore the business model. That's why we're trying to think about it from the very beginning.
Yeah, and Alex, kind of as our industry rep on the panel, I was wondering if you could talk to about that business side of things, but then also sort of what opportunities do exist for companies or researchers who are interested in AV applications for rural settings.
Yeah, and one thing I wanted to build off of what Rich said is you've heard what the state of Ohio has done, how much effort the state is putting into this region and the rural aspect of it. It's something that needs to be replicated if this wants to happen elsewhere. It's not something that one party can do. You need to have the technology that's ready, and that's where we need the AV developers, whether that be the full vehicle or the system level or even the sensor level, to come forward and start trying out their systems, say that they do have the technology that's ready there. That's the biggest place for industry to come forward. Infrastructure owners, yes, I'm going to dedicate a certain part of my budget to update these, but I'm going to want to sit down with the developers and listen to what they need. I want to make sure that I'm doing something that prepares me, and it's something that I don't have to repaint 5 years when you tell me I need to change it. It's something that it's a conversation that needs to happen with, especially as Rich said, we've involved Ohio University. What are the business cases? It's really, we can start there. And we talked about it with the grapple case, traveling to a campsite. What are the use cases? Where do these need to go? And that's where we need people to speak up, because right now, I mean, you're going to have a higher population of people in urban areas. They need to have a shuttle that takes them around campus. They need to go from point A to point B within an urban setting. And that's where we focus most of our time. We need people to speak up and talk about what are these rural applications. And then again, match technology, public sector, and other industry partners to be able to collaborate and come together to form these solutions. And so really the opportunities are endless out there right now is really what I'm trying to say. We don't need just developers. We need people from business. We need people from the automotive industry, from the technology industry, and from, I guess, everyday citizens to help expand on what the capability of these vehicles can be.
Yeah, and then Jiaqi, do you have any kind of final thoughts on what any public officials of rural communities who might be watching this right now, on any kind of advice you might give them on how they could start preparing or thinking about incorporating AVs into their transportation?
Yeah, I mean, this is actually the question when we, as a transportation researcher, when we try to design the future mobility systems, transportation systems, always thinking about how, as I've been mentioned a couple of times, how these AVs can maybe as a separate mode, in the future transportation systems. One of the project we are working with the Southern California Council of Governments is to understand, okay, in the future, when you have a person-owned AVs, then you have AV shared services, right? When some people may choose to buy AVs, that's their choice. But some people, we don't want to buy AVs at all. They're just using the shared services. We are trying to collecting data, collecting survey to understand that behavior. But eventually there will be a certain need that people will use those shared AVs, and these shared AVs, absolutely, they will travel, transport you from A to B, but it will be served as a first mile, last mile, or first couple of mile solutions. Then you will need a holistic design. Transportation agencies will need to design their, for example, public transit network to connect with that. Unless there's a fully connected network service, I think the business model is really hard to justify. And I really see this as a public-private partnership really to make this happen.
Yeah, and real quick, right before we wrap up, thinking about that holistic design, Rich, I wanted to have you kind of wrap us up with, we got a lot of questions on how AVs might be able to improve the reach or the efficiency of government services in rural areas. You know, services such as paratransit for people with disabilities or access to medical care that can be especially challenging for communities in rural areas. Could you discuss how you see AVs playing a role in those services?
Absolutely. It's an important question. We're thinking about it. There are a lot of people thinking about it. You know, there's the great work being done by the Inclusive Design Challenge at the national level. Within our Ohio ADS grant, we're looking at, we've pitched to include technology called Paralift from robotic research that would help with at least the access to the vehicle side of things. And one of our interns, Jen Schlegel, I'll give a shout out to her. She's a fantastic advisor to us on these topics. She's a brilliant early career engineer and innovator, but she's also a user of paratransit. So we're and that connects us to users and stakeholders. And so we're absolutely thinking about this. The whole idea of everything we're doing with rural mobility is inclusion of the rural communities themselves, but then also inclusion of everyone within those communities. I couldn't think of something more important to be focused on. And we're just at the early stages of that conversation, but if you don't talk about it from the beginning, you're just going to get off track and those audiences won't be included. So incredibly important topic with a lot of work ahead of us.
Absolutely. Well, sadly, we're at the end of our time together. That went so fast, but Alex, Rich, Jiaqi, thank you so much again for taking the time to join us this afternoon and discussing this topic.
Thank you.
Yeah, and thank you to our live audience for joining us again, and especially those who submitted questions. If you'd like to follow up with us at PAVE or one of the panelists on this topic, just please reach out to us via our website form or reply to the registration email. And next week, we will be continuing our equity conversation in discussing AI bias and how it can affect AVs. And you can register for that panel and our other February topics at pavecampaign.org/events. Thank you, everybody.